When you look at a sprawling state-of-the-art skyscraper, I think the instinct is always to just marvel at the glass and the steel. You just see the polished product.
Right, the aesthetic, what the architect wants you to see.
Exactly. But if you talk to a structural engineer, they're completely ignoring the reflections in the windows. They're looking for the fault lines, right?
Yeah.
They want to see the foundation, the load-bearing walls, the places where the structural tension actually sits.
Because that underlying schematic is what dictates whether the building is actually going to stay standing when, the tectonic plates inevitably shift.
Yeah, and today, we're basically applying that exact diagnostic approach to an entire nation. Welcome to the deep dive. We have a seriously dense stack of current affairs sources to get through today.
We really do. We're covering everything from landmark Supreme Court rulings to massive macroeconomic shifts over in the Middle East.
Right. And if you are listening to this as a strategist or policy analyst, or maybe you're a serious learner preparing for the highest levels of civil service, just memorizing these daily headlines gives you zero competitive advantage.
None at all. I mean, top-tier analytical thinking is entirely about connecting seemingly unrelated dots.
Yeah. Like, how does a judicial ruling on hate speech in New Delhi connect to, say, our maritime diplomacy in the Indian Ocean? So today, we're mapping out the bigger picture, the blueprint.
Let's start right at the bedrock of that blueprint then, the Constitution. Specifically, the fault lines around fraternity, faith, and social justice.
Right. Justices Vikram Nath and Sandeep Mehta recently delivered this massive 125-page Supreme Court judgment on hate speech. And the court explicitly diagnosed that hate speech basically comes from this us versus them mindset.
Yeah, they argued that this binary fundamentally corrupts the whole concept of fraternity, especially in a society as diverse as ours. I mean, as long as that social division is weaponized, the constitutional promise of fraternity is it's unrealized.
But the really crucial legal maneuver here was what the court refused to do. They actively declined to draft new hate speech laws, which definitely frustrated some petitioners who wanted a bespoke statutory framework for hate crimes.
It did. But the bench's reasoning was firmly rooted in the separation of powers. They basically said, look, creating new statutory schemes is judicial lawmaking. That steps heavily on the legislature's toes.
And they insisted the current architecture, the BNS and the BNSS, is already sufficient.
Exactly. The vulnerability isn't a lack of legislation. The issue is the absolute apathy in application by local authorities.
Okay, so to conceptualize this, it's basically like having a top-tier, state-of-the-art security system installed in your house, right? But the guards just refuse to turn it on.
That's exactly it.
And meanwhile, people are outside protesting, demanding that a second identical security system be bought. The issue isn't the law, it's the enforcement.
That captures the dynamic perfectly. The court is telling law enforcement to just activate the existing system, implement it fairly across the board, rooting the whole mandate in the ethos of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, the world is one family.
Right, and that tension between these high universal ideals and the actual messy social realities on the ground, that brings us perfectly to the Sabarimala review case.
Yes. The profound debate over freedom of religion versus the right to equality. We've got senior advocate Indira Jaising arguing before a 9-judge bench.
Yeah, she was representing 2 women who entered the temple after the 2018 verdict. And her argument was deeply philosophical. She basically asserted that social reform inherently requires the reform of religion itself.
Right. Her core premise was that equality under Article 14 and dignity under Article 21 simply cannot take a backseat to doctrinal religious freedom.
She gave a really stark warning too, didn't she? Saying that without allowing religion to evolve, Hinduism risks complete balkanization.
Yes, balkanization. Meaning if every single temple or sect claims absolute autonomy to set its own exclusionary rules, it just fragments the unifying cultural architecture of the whole country.
But then there's the judicial counter-argument. Justice B.V. Nagaratna was pretty sharp about the opposing risk.
Very sharp. She highlighted the delicate balance required here. The petitioners seeking the review are arguing that reform cannot just hollow out a religion until it ceases to exist in its original form.
Right, like where's the line?
Exactly. Justice Nagaratna emphasized the need to distinguish between reforms that, eradicate genuine social evils versus those that are just intrusive inroads into core theological doctrines.
It's an incredibly high-stakes tightrope walk. And speaking of constitutional morality, that segues right into another massive fault line. This current debate over applying the creamy layer principle to SC and ST reservations.
Yeah, we are seeing fresh petitions at the Supreme Court that are heavily leaning on the recent 2024 Devinder Singh judgment.
which seems like a major misinterpretation of that ruling, honestly. Let's clarify the mechanics here. The Davinder Singh judgment allowed states to implement subclassification within SC communities, right?
Yes. Subclassification and the creamy layer are fundamentally distinct operational tools.
Right.
Subclassification asks which specific subcommunities are the least represented, and it prioritizes them. It's targeted inclusion. The creamy layer doctrine, on the other hand, is about exclusion.
Meaning it removes individuals from eligibility based purely on their current economic status, like they do for OBCs. But during that Davinder Singh ruling, a few judges made some passing remarks about the creamy layer logic.
4 of the 7 judges did, yes. And now these new petitions are trying to weaponize those passing remarks to force an income-based exclusion onto SC and ST quotas.
But wait, to understand why applying an economic filter to SCSTs is so controversial, we really have to go back to B.R. Ambedkar, don't we? His warning at the 1936 Mahar Conference.
Precisely. He explicitly argued that economic attainment does not magically neutralize caste-based discrimination. An educated, wealthy Mamar still faces acute prejudice in social settings.
Because economic mobility and social emancipation operate on completely separate tracks.
Exactly.
But, okay, let me push back on that for a second, just looking at it through a modern 2026 lens. If an SC candidate is born into a family of millionaires with generational wealth, doesn't that capital inherently alter their access to opportunity compared to a rural, uneducated candidate? Why shouldn't income be a proxy today?
It's a very intuitive assumption, but the sociological data sharply contradicts it. Policy analysts talk about the creamy layer trap.
The trap, what does that mean?
Well, if you set an income ceiling, you actually end up excluding people who are barely middle class, not the ultra-wealthy. A family earning, say, 6 lakh rupees a year gets categorically equated with one earning 24 lakh just because they both cross some arbitrary line.
Oh, I see.
And rigorous statistical research, like the studies by Nishith Prakash mentioned in the sources, shows that this whole idea of elite capture of quota benefits is largely a statistical myth.
Wait, really? A myth?
Yeah, the measurable positive impacts of the quota policy are overwhelmingly concentrated among less educated SC members in rural areas.
So using income as this blunt policy instrument just risks chopping the lower rungs off the ladder for people who've just started to climb.
Exactly. It collapses the complex reality of historical social subordination into a rudimentary math equation. And that was never the constitutional basis for the SCST list.
Wow. Okay, so all these towering ideals, fraternity, equality, social justice, they really only matter if the institutions protecting them actually work. Which brings us to a pretty intense reality check on our institutions.
You're talking about the Allahabad High Court's unprecedented critique of the National Human Rights Commission.
Yeah. Justice Atul Sridhar was not holding back. He openly criticized the NHRC for functionally bypassing its core mandate.
The scrutiny was intense. He observed that the commission was seemingly ignoring acute human rights violations, specifically citing mob lynching and targeted violence against minority communities.
And instead, the NHRC was using its resources to investigate what? Alleged financial irregularities across 558 aided madrasas in UP.
Right.
Which, I mean, so the NHRC is essentially acting like a fire department that ignores a blazing building so they can go hand out parking tickets.
That's a great way to put it.
Like, financial mismanagement is obviously a valid state issue.
Yeah.
But it's not the jurisdiction of an apex human rights body.
That was exactly Justice Sridharan's rationale. He said financial mismanagement should be handled by state audits or public interest litigations. The NHRC's unique suo motu power is designed for when marginalized communities are attacked and local police fail to act.
Though, to maintain total impartiality here, we should note the internal dynamics of that bench. Justice Vivek Saran actually dissented on the timing of those remarks, right?
He did. Because the NHRC wasn't actually represented in the courtroom that day. Their counsel had asked for an adjournment. So Justice Saran argued that making adverse remarks without letting the institution defend itself violates natural justice.
Which is fair. But the broader analytical takeaway for us is just this rising judicial impatience with statutory bodies drifting from what they were built to do.
Absolutely.
And speaking of institutions not delivering on their mandates, let's look at public health. The latest NSO 80th round data on healthcare is just an absolute masterclass in the law of unintended consequences.
The paradox of insurance. This data is wild. On the surface, it looks like a massive policy victory. Health insurance coverage has exploded.
Yeah, the numbers are huge.
Right.
47.4% of rural households and 44.3% of urban households now has some form of coverage.
Yeah, and that surge is almost entirely driven by government-financed health insurance, primarily the PMJY scheme.
Jumping from like 13% to over 45% in rural areas in just a few years is a monumental infrastructural achievement.
It is. But the subsequent data shows a severe systemic flaw. Because despite this massive safety net, overall hospitalization rates haven't really moved, and much more alarmingly, the out-of-pocket medical expenses for patients in the private sector have literally doubled since 2017.
Wait, doubled? Let's break that down. If tens of millions of people are now insured by the government, how are they paying twice as much out of their own pockets at the hospital?
It's all in the architecture of the reimbursement model. 57% of patients using these government schemes are going to private hospitals.
Okay.
But the government sets package rates for treatments that are often way below market rates. So private hospitals will admit the patient under the scheme, but then aggressively bill them out of pocket for unlisted consumables, premium diagnostics, or room upgrades just to cover their margins.
Oh, wow. So what does this mean for the taxpayer? Are we essentially using public funds to weave this massive safety net, only to find out it has a giant hole funneling money straight into private healthcare profits?
That is the exact concern among health economists right now. The private sector is unlocking a huge new demographic that used to lack purchasing power. And what's worse, the NSO data shows that in urban areas, only 13% of the people actually using these schemes are from the poorest economic quintile.
So it's disproportionately benefiting the relatively better off anyway.
Exactly. It forces us to really question if an insurance-led model can actually deliver equitable healthcare, or if we should be putting those funds directly into building public hospitals.
Right, because managing these massive domestic challenges, healthcare, institutional integrity, you can't effectively project power abroad if your home front is fracturing.
No, stabilizing the home front is a strict prerequisite for geopolitical maneuvering.
And the geopolitical chessboard is definitely accelerating. Let's pivot to the recent SEO defense ministers meeting in Bishkek.
Right. Defense Minister Rajnath Singh met with his Chinese counterpart, Admiral Dong Jun, to discuss peace along the LAC. But strategically, the big moment was Singh's broader rhetoric at the summit. He unequivocally stated that terrorism has no nationality and no theology.
And saying that specific phrase in Bishkek is highly calculated. The SEO includes Russia, China, Iran, and crucially, Pakistan. He's using a multilateral forum for targeted strategic signaling about Pakistan's role in regional instability right to Beijing and Moscow's faces.
It's pure diplomatic hard power. He's drawing a firm boundary that no historical grievance can excuse cross-border terrorism.
And while we're securing the northern continental flank, we're also running a massive maritime strategy down south. The Indian Navy just wrapped up a joint diving exercise, INSLN DIVX 2026, with Sri Lanka and Colombo.
Yes, deploying the diving support vessel INS Nirikshak. But looking at the sources, this is way beyond standard military interoperability. It's deeply layered with humanitarian diplomacy.
Right. India handed over 2 BHASM cubes under the Aroja Maitri initiative. These are basically rapid deployment, portable hospital units.
Which perfectly operationalizes the Mahasagar vision, security, and growth for all in the region. By providing this critical disaster response tech, India is turning its military presence in the Indian Ocean into an indispensable regional public good.
It's the diplomatic equivalent of building a protective moat. But, even as we secure the borders in the oceans, we are still so vulnerable to global macroeconomic tremors. Like this news that the UAE is reportedly considering an exit from OPEC.
Yeah, the Petroleum Ministry says it's too early to comment, but the mechanics here are huge for us. OPEC is a cartel, right?
Yeah.
It enforces production quotas to constrain global supply and keep crude prices high.
But the UAE has been investing billions to expand its oil production capacity.
Exactly. And staying in OPEC means leaving all that expensive infrastructure sitting idle just to comply with the cartel's quotas. They want to monetize those reserves now.
So if you're managing India's economy, this is massive. Because India is so dependent on imported energy.
Right. If the UAE exits and just starts pumping crude at maximum capacity, it could fracture OPEC's pricing discipline. That means a drop in global oil prices.
And for New Delhi, cheaper crude means a lower import bill, stabilized forex reserves, and major relief on domestic inflation. It's like India is playing three-dimensional chess. You're securing the high Himalayas, building a humanitarian moat in the Indian Ocean, and nervously watching the global fuel gauge as the UAE shakes up OPEC.
It's all deeply interconnected.
And securing borders and energy is really just the defensive play. The offensive play is aggressive economic and technological expansion. Which brings us to the India-New Zealand Free Trade Agreement.
This FTA is a masterclass in securing compounded gains. I mean, New Zealand is a relatively small market, but India got immediate zero tariffs. And most importantly, for domestic politics, India successfully excluded its highly sensitive dairy sector from the agreement.
Even with relentless pressure from Wellington. Which makes me wonder, if New Zealand couldn't get access for their dairy exports, why even sign the deal?
Because the nature of global trade is shifting. New Zealand knows the long-term value of integrating with the fastest-growing major economy. They secured access for their services sector and digital trade.
And didn't they commit to a massive investment corridor?
Yes, New Zealand committed to facilitating $20 billion in investments into India over the next 15 years. It's a calculated play by India to attract sustained foreign capital, kind of mirroring the recent EFTA pact.
So while we restructure our external trade, we are also radically attempting to restructure our domestic transport. The Ministry of Road Transport and Highways is pushing for the homologation of E100 vehicles.
Meaning engines calibrated to run on a 100% ethanol. It's a dual-purpose strategy slashing the domestic carbon footprint while reducing our vulnerability to the exact kind of fossil fuel shocks we just talked about with OPEC.
Right, but the ministry is also heavily focused on transport safety, proposing the mandatory integration of V2V vehicle-to-vehicle communication systems, which, the theory is brilliant. Cars continuously broadcast their speed and location to each other to prevent accidents.
It's incredible technology.
But looking at the logistical reality, I see a major red flag here. We want to mandate that cars talk to each other, but the industry hasn't even settled on the technological language they should speak.
You're talking about DSRC versus CV2X.
Exactly. Will it be DSRC using dedicated short-range radio frequencies, or CV2X, which relies on broader cellular networks like 5G? We lack the back-end infrastructure for either. Aren't we putting the cart before the horse by mandating the hardware inside the cars first?
You risk forcing consumers to pay for expensive technology that basically just sits dormant. It really highlights the friction between sweeping policy ambition and the gritty realities of infrastructural readiness.
Yeah.
And we see that exact same friction manifesting in the Great Nicobar mega project.
The $9 billion strategic development plan.
Yes, position on a highly vulnerable ecological reserve. It is rapidly becoming the ultimate test case for the trade-offs of national development.
The political opposition is fierce. We've got leaders like Rahul Gandhi publicly calling it destruction dressed as development, pointing out a severe lack of consultation with indigenous populations.
And to maintain our impartiality here, the conflict has escalated to the judiciary. There are active challenges pending before the Calcutta High Court.
Right, scrutinizing whether mandatory environmental consent procedures were followed and if the rights of forest-dwelling communities were legally settled.
The state maintains that all ecological damage has been accounted for and compensated, but the courts will be the ultimate arbiter. It perfectly encapsulates the tension of engineering a modern strategic outpost while navigating ecological preservation.
It really does. And while India wrestles with how to build its future in places like Nicobar, it is concurrently executing this highly sophisticated strategy to reclaim its past. We've had a massive cultural victory recently regarding the restitution of heritage.
Oh, this was incredible. U.S. authorities formally returned 657 trafficked antiquities to India, valued at nearly $14 million.
And this wasn't just a symbolic diplomatic handshake, was it? This was the culmination of aggressive law enforcement. How exactly did they dismantle these smuggling networks?
It took over a decade of forensic accounting by U.S. Homeland Security investigations. They didn't just raid warehouses, they audited decades of auction catalogs, matched them against dusty theft reports from rural Indian police stations, and tracked the money laundering through shell galleries in London and New York. This completely dismantled the institutionalized smuggling syndicates run by figures like Subhash Kapoor and Nancy Weiner.
The scale of the theft is just staggering. I mean, the sources detail recovering a $7.5 million red sandstone Buddha looted from northern India, a bronze Avalokiteshvara stolen from a Raipur museum in the 80s.
They even recovered a dancing Ganesha that had been given entirely fabricated provenance papers just so it could be auctioned at Christie's.
But does this actually change the shadowy global art market, or is it just a one-off win?
It fundamentally alters the risk calculus. By seizing high-value items directly from prestigious auction houses and elite private collectors, law enforcement signals that establishing false provenance is no longer a shield against federal prosecution. It destroys the financial incentive.
Though it is worth noting, there are still over 1,000 identified artifacts awaiting repatriation.
True. It's an ongoing process.
Well, to bring this all into focus, if you were analyzing these developments for the UPSC exams or a policy brief, the absolute crucial takeaway today is the interconnectedness of the system. You can't fully grasp the push for E100 ethanol vehicles without understanding the threat of an OPEC shakeup.
Right.
You can't evaluate our maritime diplomacy in Sri Lanka without recognizing the necessity of domestic institutional stability with the NHRC or public health care. Policy is not a series of isolated events. It is a continuous, interlocking chain of cause and effect.
It is, and examining that interlocking chain leaves us with a really critical paradigm to consider. Today, we mapped a nation relentlessly engineering its modernization, from debating cellular tech in our vehicles to defending multi-billion-dollar outposts in the Bay of Bengal.
Yeah.
Yet, simultaneously, that same nation is fighting in foreign courts to reclaim its ancient deities and arguing in its own Supreme Court over century-old interpretations of faith and caste.
Oh, quite a contrast.
It demands a moment of reflection. As a society accelerates toward becoming a global superpower, what are the precise mechanisms required to ensure we don't inadvertently bulldoze the very social, cultural, and ecological foundations that support our ascent? Can true modernization exist without rigorous preservation?
That is the ultimate question for any strategist attempting to read the blueprint of a nation. The diagnostic X-ray of a country is never a static image. It is shifting, it is evolving, and it requires constant, critical vigilance to interpret accurately. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep examining the structures around you, keep searching for those hidden fault lines, and we'll see you next time.